The rain came down in sheets, pounding against my windshield as I drove home from my late shift at Mercy General. 12 hours on my feet had left me bone-tired, the kind of exhaustion that seeps into your marrow. 23 years as an ER nurse, and nights like these still hollowed me out. I'd lost a patient today, a young woman, car accident, internal bleeding we couldn't control. Her parents arrived 10 minutes after she was gone. I squinted through the downpour, wipers fighting a losing battle against the deluge. That's when I saw him, a teenage boy, soaked through, walking along the shoulder of Highway 16 with his thumb out. In the glow of my headlights, he looked like a half-drowned cat, shoulders hunched against the storm. I'd driven past dozens of hitchhikers over the years without a second thought. Never pick up strangers, my father's voice echoed in my head. But something about this kid, maybe it was the defeated slump of his shoulders or the way the rain plastered his dark hair to his forehead, made me tap my brakes. I pulled over about 20 yards ahead of him and watched in my rearview mirror as he ran toward my car, splashing through puddles. When he reached the passenger door, I lowered the window just enough to speak. "Where are you headed?" I asked, studying him carefully. He couldn't have been more than 16, with hollow cheeks and eyes that held too much wariness for someone so young. "Pinewood," he said, water streaming down his face. "I'm trying to get home." Pinewood was a small town about 30 miles north, not exactly on my way, but not impossibly far either. "I'm Michael," he added, as if sensing my hesitation. "I missed the last bus and my phone died. I just need to get home." I should have driven away. Every instinct honed from years of city living told me to leave, to not invite trouble into my car on a deserted highway at 11:30 at night. But I thought about my own son, away at college now, and what I'd want someone to do if he were stranded in the rain. "Get in," I said, unlocking the door. I couldn't possibly have known that this simple act of kindness, letting a drenched teenager into my car on a stormy night, would completely upend my carefully ordered life and force me to confront the empty spaces I'd been running from for years. My name is Sarah Donovan, 52 years old, divorced for 8 years, one adult son who calls dutifully every Sunday from his campus across the country. I've lived in the same 3-bedroom house in Lakeside for 18 years, the last 8 of them alone. My life runs on routine. Early mornings, coffee from the same mug, 12-hour shifts at Mercy General, quiet evenings with books or British crime dramas, and the occasional dinner with the same 3 friends I've had since nursing school. After David left, after 22 years of marriage, he decided he needed something more. I'd thrown myself into work. The controlled chaos of the emergency room became my sanctuary. There, in other people's crises, I could forget the silence that waited for me at home. Michael shivered in my passenger seat, his backpack clutched to his chest like a shield. I cranked up the heat. "Thank you," he said, voice barely audible above the rain and the hum of the defroster. "I didn't know what I was going to do." "What were you doing out there?" I asked, eyes on the road as we merged back onto the highway. He hesitated, and I caught the slight shift in his posture from the corner of my eye. "I was visiting a friend in Lakeside, lost track of time." The lie hung between us, obvious but unchallenged. I'd heard enough lies in my career, from patients hiding addictions, from my ex-husband explaining late nights, from my own son during his difficult teenage years, to recognize one when I heard it. "I'm Sarah," I said instead of pressing him. "I'm a nurse at Mercy." "Cool," he replied, relaxing slightly. "My mom was a nurse before—" He stopped abruptly. "Before what?" "Before she got sick." His voice flattened, and he turned to stare out the window at the rain-blurred lights we passed. I knew that tone, had heard it countless times from family members in hospital waiting rooms. It was the voice of someone who had learned to navigate around a painful truth, like stepping carefully over a landmine. "I'm sorry," I said simply. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. There's a strange intimacy in sharing a small space with a stranger during a storm, a temporary bubble outside normal life where usual rules don't quite apply. "You have kids?" he asked after a while. "A son, Jason. He's in college now, studying engineering in California." The familiar ache bloomed in my chest, pride mixed with loneliness. "What about your family?" Will they be worried about you? Another hesitation. It's just my dad now. He works nights. He probably hasn't even noticed I'm gone. Something in his voice, a careful flatness that didn't match the content of his words, raised the hairs on the back of my neck. 23 years in emergency medicine teaches you to notice discrepancies, the small tells that suggest something isn't right. Pinewood's the next exit, Michael said, pointing to a green highway sign looming in the darkness. I signaled and moved into the exit lane. Where should I drop you? The gas station at Main and Elm is fine. I can walk from there. In this rain? I can take you home. No. The sharpness of his response startled both of us. I mean, the gas station is fine. My house is... It's complicated. I pulled into the brightly lit parking lot of the Quick Stop, the only building showing signs of life in the sleeping town. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but puddles reflected the fluorescent lights in broken patterns across the asphalt. Michael gathered his backpack and reached for the door handle. Thanks for the ride. Really. Wait. I reached into my purse and pulled out a business card with my cell number. If you ever need anything, a ride, or someone to talk to. He looked at the card for a long moment before taking it, his fingers leaving damp prints on the edges. Why would you care? You don't even know me. The question caught me off guard with its rawness. I don't know. Sometimes people just need someone to see them, I guess. A flash of something, recognition maybe, crossed his face before he nodded once and slipped out of the car. I watched him walk toward the convenience store, his silhouette growing smaller under the harsh lights. Only after he disappeared inside did I put the car in reverse and head back toward the highway. All the way home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd missed something important, some clue that should have told me more about the soaking wet boy with careful lies and wary eyes. But by the time I pulled into my driveway, exhaustion had overtaken concern, and all I wanted was my bed and the blessed oblivion of sleep. I couldn't have known then that Michael would call me 3 days later, his voice shaking with fear. I couldn't have known that answering that call would lead me to uncover a decades-old secret that would connect our lives in ways neither of us could have imagined. And I certainly couldn't have known that helping a stranger find his way home would ultimately lead me to find my own. The call came on Thursday afternoon as I was folding laundry, the mindless task filling the too-quiet house. When my phone rang with an unknown number, I almost didn't answer. Telemarketer, I thought, or another political survey. But some instinct made me pick up. Hello? At first, there was only silence, then a shaky exhale. Sarah? It's Michael. From the other night. It took me a moment to place the voice, and then the image of the rain-soaked teenager flashed in my mind. Michael, are you okay? I didn't know who else to call. His voice cracked. I think something's wrong with my dad. A chill ran through me. In my line of work, those words usually preceded the worst kind of news. What's happening? Do you need an ambulance? No, no ambulance. The panic in his voice was unmistakable. He won't wake up. But he's breathing. I think he took something. Is this an overdose? Michael, if your father needs medical attention... Please, he interrupted. Can you just come? I don't know what to do, and I can't call 911. Please. Every professional instinct screamed that this was wrong, that I should tell him to hang up and dial emergency services immediately. But something in his desperate plea reached past my training to the mother in me, to the woman who had seen too many scared kids in impossible situations. Give me the address, I said, already reaching for my keys. 20 minutes later, I pulled up in front of a small, weathered bungalow on a quiet street lined with similar homes. The paint was peeling, and the small, front yard needed mowing, but it wasn't the neglected property I'd half expected from Michael's desperation. He must have been watching for me because the front door opened before I could knock. Up close and dry, he looked both younger and older than I remembered. Thin face, dark circles under intelligent eyes, a wariness that spoke of responsibilities beyond his years. Thank you for coming, he said, stepping back to let me in. The house was dim, curtains drawn against the afternoon sun. It smelled of coffee and something medicinal. Michael led me down a short hallway to a bedroom where a man lay sprawled across an unmade bed, fully dressed except for his shoes. I went immediately into nurse mode, checking his pulse, strong but slow, his breathing, even, and his pupils, constricted but reactive. Middle-aged, with Michael's dark hair threaded with gray, he had the slack-faced appearance of someone in a deep pharmaceutical sleep. Has he taken something? Prescription medications? I asked, scanning the nightstand where several orange bottles stood in a cluster. Michael nodded, picking up one of the bottles. These are for pain, from his back injury, but I think… He swallowed hard. I think maybe he took too many, on purpose. The implication hung in the air between us. I looked more carefully at the man on the bed, noticing now the gauntness of his face, the way his clothes hung loosely on his frame. Then I glanced around the room, at the dirty clothes piled in corners, the empty whiskey bottle on the floor, the framed photo face down on the dresser. How long has he been like this? I asked, keeping my voice clinical, professional. I found him this morning when I got up for school. He worked last night, so I thought he was just sleeping, but then I couldn't wake him up before I left. Michael's voice was flat, controlled in a way that spoke of long practice. When I came home and he still hadn't moved, I got scared. I checked the man's vitals again. His breathing is good, pulse is stable. I think he's just heavily sedated. Has this happened before? Michael's silence was answer enough. Michael, I said gently, your father needs help that I can't give him here. He needs to go to the hospital. We can't afford it, he said immediately. And if they think it was on purpose, they'll put him in the psychiatric ward. We've been through that before. It makes everything worse. I looked at the boy, because despite his composure, that's what he was, a boy of maybe 16 trying to manage an impossible situation, and felt a surge of anger at whatever circumstances had placed this burden on his young shoulders. Let me make you something to eat, I said, changing tactics. And we can talk about options. Relief flickered across his face. Kitchen's this way. The kitchen, like the rest of the house, showed signs of a life interrupted. Dishes were stacked in the sink, mail piled on the counter, a calendar on the wall still showing last month. I opened the refrigerator to find it nearly empty. A carton of milk, some eggs, condiments, and a 6-pack of beer. Grilled cheese okay? I asked, finding bread in the freezer and a package of processed cheese slices. Michael nodded and sat at the small table, suddenly looking exhausted. As I moved around the kitchen, gathering a pan and spatula, I noticed a photograph stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet. Michael, several years younger, standing between his father and a woman with a bright smile and Michael's same dark eyes. His mother, I assumed. When did she pass away? I asked softly, nodding toward the photo. He looked up, surprised, then followed my gaze. 2 years ago. Cancer. I'm sorry, I said, placing a sandwich in the pan. That must have been very hard for both of you. Dad never really came back from it, Michael said, staring at his hands. He works at the mill on the night shift, comes home, takes his pills, sleeps. Some days are better than others. And who takes care of you? The question slipped out before I could stop it. A small, humorless smile touched his lips. I manage. The sandwich sizzled in the pan, the mundane sound at odds with the weight of our conversation. I flipped it onto a plate and set it in front of him, then sat down across the table. Michael, I understand wanting to protect your father, but if he's overdosing, whether accidentally or intentionally, he needs professional help. Last time they took him to the psychiatric ward, I ended up in foster care for 3 weeks, he said, not touching the sandwich. The family was nice enough, but this is my home. He's all I have left. The raw honesty in his voice struck me like a physical blow. I thought of my own son, safely ensconced in his college dorm 3,000 miles away, his biggest worry probably an upcoming exam or relationship drama. The contrast with the boy sitting across from me was stark and painful. Eat, I said gently. Food helps you think. He took a small bite of the sandwich, then another, hunger apparently overriding his anxiety. While he ate, I considered our options. As a medical professional, I had a duty to report a situation where a minor might be in danger. But I also knew how blunt and often ineffective the system could be, how it could sometimes cause more harm than good in its efforts to help. What if we make a deal? I said finally. I'll help monitor your dad tonight, make sure he's stable. In the morning when he's awake, we talk to him about getting some real help, outpatient, so he doesn't have to be admitted. But if he refuses, or if this happens again, we have to involve proper authorities. I can't in good conscience leave you in an unsafe situation. Michael studied me for a long moment, wariness and hope warring in his expression. Why would you do that? Stay here all night for people you don't even know? It was a fair question, one I wasn't entirely sure I had an answer for. Why had I driven 30 miles to help a stranger? Why was I offering to spend the night in this sad house with its unconscious occupant and his too old teenage son? Because sometimes the system doesn't work for people who need it most, I said finally. And because I've been a nurse long enough to know when someone needs more than just medical help. What I didn't say was that the empty silence of my own house had become almost unbearable lately. That the routine I'd built to protect myself from loneliness had become a prison of its own. That helping this boy and his father felt like the first meaningful thing I'd done outside of work in longer than I cared to admit. Okay, Michael said, nodding slowly. Deal. I sent him to do his homework while I checked on his father again. The man, Robert, according to the prescription bottles, was still deeply unconscious but stable. I counted his remaining pills, checked the dates on the prescriptions, and confirmed my suspicion. He'd taken enough to knock himself out thoroughly, but not enough to suggest a serious suicide attempt. It was the behavior of someone trying to escape his reality for a while, not end it permanently. As night fell, I made another sandwich for Michael and settled onto a chair in Robert's room with a book I'd found on their shelf. The house grew quiet except for the occasional creak of old wood and the steady breathing of the man on the bed. Around midnight, Michael appeared in the doorway in pajama pants and a t-shirt, looking younger than he had all day. You should get some sleep, I told him. I'll wake you if anything changes. He hesitated. Are you sure you don't want the couch? I can sit with him. I've pulled plenty of night shifts. This chair and I will be fine. He nodded, relief evident in the slump of his shoulders. Thank you, Sarah. Really. After he left, I sat in the dim light, watching the gentle rise and fall of Robert's chest, thinking about the strange turns life takes. Yesterday, these people had been strangers. Tonight, I was keeping vigil in their home, invested in their welfare in a way I couldn't quite explain. Around 3 a.m., Robert stirred, mumbling something incoherent before settling again. I checked his vitals, stronger now, closer to normal, and felt a wave of relief. He would wake up. The conversation ahead wouldn't be easy, but at least we would have it. In the stillness of that unfamiliar house, watching over a broken family I barely knew, I felt something shift inside me, a door opening to a possibility I hadn't considered before. I didn't know yet how deeply my life would become intertwined with theirs, or how the secrets buried in Robert's past would eventually force me to confront my own. But sitting there in the darkness, I felt the first tremors of the earthquake that was about to reshape the landscape of my carefully ordered existence. And strangely, despite everything, it felt like coming home. Morning arrived with pale sunlight filtering through the bedroom curtains. I'd dozed intermittently throughout the night, jerking awake every hour to check on Robert. Around 7 a.m., his breathing pattern changed, and his eyelids began to flutter. I straightened in my chair, mentally preparing for what would likely be a difficult conversation. How do you tell a man you've never met that his son called a stranger for help because he was afraid his father was trying to kill himself? Robert's eyes opened slowly, confusion giving way to alarm when he registered my presence. He tried to sit up too quickly and groaned, pressing a hand to his forehead. Easy, I said, keeping my voice low and calm. You're okay. My name is Sarah Donovan. I'm a nurse. Michael asked me to come check on you. Michael? His voice was rough, disoriented. He looked around the room as if expecting to see his son. Where is he? Still sleeping, I think. It's early. I handed him a glass of water from the nightstand. Small sips. He obeyed automatically, wincing as he swallowed. What happened? You tell me, I said, keeping my tone neutral. Michael couldn't wake you yesterday. He was scared. Comprehension dawned on his face, followed quickly by shame. He looked away, setting the glass down with a shaking hand. The pills. I took too many. On purpose? His jaw tightened. I just wanted to sleep. Sometimes it's the only way to. He stopped, seeming to remember he was talking to a stranger. Who are you again? How do you know Michael? I explained briefly about picking Michael up from the highway and how he'd called me yesterday. With each word, Robert's expression darkened. He was hitchhiking? The horror in his voice seemed genuine. Jesus Christ. And then he brought a stranger into our house? What the hell was he thinking? He was thinking his father wouldn't wake up and he was scared, I said, more sharply than I'd intended. He was thinking he needed help and didn't know where else to turn. Robert ran a hand over his face, the anger seeming to drain out of him. I never meant for him to find me like that. I thought he'd be at school when I took them. The admission hung in the air between us. Robert, I said gently, I understand grief. I understand pain. But what you're doing isn't just hurting you, it's hurting your son. He flinched as if I'd struck him. You don't know anything about us. I know Michael is 16 and taking care of himself and you. I know he's terrified of calling 911 because he might end up in foster care again. I know he's trying to hold everything together while watching his father disappear into pills and alcohol. You have no right, he began, but was interrupted by Michael's appearance in the doorway. Dad? His voice was small, uncertain. You're awake. The transformation in Robert was immediate and heartbreaking. The defensive anger melted away, replaced by a fragile smile. Hey, buddy. I'm okay, just took my meds wrong. Michael didn't move from the doorway, his body tense with disbelief. You weren't answering me. I shook you and you wouldn't wake up. I'm sorry, Robert said, and the words seemed to physically pain him. I didn't mean to scare you. You always say that, Michael's voice cracked. After every time you say you're sorry and it won't happen again. But it does. It keeps happening. I stood quietly, feeling like an intruder in this raw family moment, but neither seemed to remember my presence. I'm trying, Robert whispered. I swear I'm trying. No, you're not. Michael's control finally broke. You're just waiting to die. Ever since Mom, you've been halfway gone, and I'm the one left picking up the pieces, making excuses to the school when you forget parent-teacher conferences, lying to the neighbors when you're too drunk to come to the door, pretending everything's fine when nothing's been fine for 2 years. The outburst left him breathless and shaking. Robert stared at his son, shock and guilt warring on his face. Michael, he started, but seemed unable to find words to continue. I stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Michael's shoulder. Why don't you go get some breakfast? I need to talk to your dad about some medical things. He hesitated, then nodded, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. After he left, I turned back to Robert. He's right, you know. Robert looked away. You think I don't know that? You think I don't hate myself every day for what I'm doing to him? His voice broke. But I don't know how to stop. Since Claire died, it's like I'm underwater all the time, everything muffled and distant. The pills, the drinking, they're the only things that make it quiet enough to bear. I sat on the edge of the bed, close enough to speak quietly, but not so close as to invade his space. I understand grief, Robert, more than you might think. But what you're doing isn't grieving. It's slowly killing yourself while forcing your son to watch. He flinched. You don't pull any punches, do you? Not when a child's welfare is at stake. I kept my voice firm but not unkind. I should be reporting this situation to Child Protective Services. By law, as a medical professional, that's what I'm supposed to do. Fear flashed across his face. Please don't. Michael can't go back into the system. I'll do better, I swear. Words aren't enough anymore. You need help, real help. Grief counseling, substance abuse treatment, possibly medication for depression, and Michael needs support too. We can't afford— There are programs, I interrupted. Community resources, sliding scale payments, support groups that cost nothing. I've made a list. I pulled a piece of paper from my pocket, something I'd prepared while he was still unconscious. These are places that can help. But you have to want it, Robert. Really want it. Not just say you do to keep Michael from being taken away. He took the paper with trembling fingers, staring at it as if it were written in a language he couldn't quite understand. Why are you doing this? Why do you care what happens to us? It was the same question Michael had asked, and I still wasn't sure I had a good answer. Because your son asked for help. Because sometimes people need someone to step in when they can't see a way forward themselves. What I didn't say was how much Robert reminded me of myself in those first dark months after David left. The numbness, the sense of moving through life behind a pane of glass, separate from everyone else. I'd had my job to anchor me, had forced myself to keep going for Jason's sake. But I recognized the drowning man in front of me, because I'd been drowning too, once. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "You can," I said with more conviction than I felt. "For Michael, you can. And you won't be doing it alone." The words surprised me as much as him. I hadn't planned to stay involved beyond this intervention. I had my own life, my own problems. And yet, looking at this broken man and thinking of his brave, desperate son, I knew I couldn't simply walk away. "I'll check in on you both," I continued. "Help navigate the resources. Make sure you're getting the support you need. But Robert, this is your one chance. If this happens again, if you put Michael through another day like yesterday, I will call the authorities. Do you understand?" He nodded slowly, something like hope flickering in his eyes for perhaps the first time in years. "I understand." I left them shortly after breakfast, extracting promises from Robert to call the first number on my list that day, and from Michael to contact me immediately if anything went wrong. As I drove home, exhaustion from the sleepless night finally caught up with me, along with a nagging worry that I'd overstepped, made promises I couldn't keep, involved myself in a situation that could only end badly. What I didn't know then, couldn't have known, was that my impulsive decision to help this family would lead to the discovery of a secret buried for decades. A secret that would reveal connections between our lives so unexpected and profound that they would challenge everything I thought I knew about fate, forgiveness, and the invisible threads that bind us to one another. 3 days later, I returned to check on them as promised, setting in motion a chain of events that would change all our lives forever. The first thing I noticed when I pulled up to Robert and Michael's house was the freshly mowed lawn. It was a small change, almost insignificant, but it hinted at effort, at care. As I approached the front door with a grocery bag in hand, just some basics I'd picked up, nothing that would seem like charity, I heard voices from inside, not raised in argument, but the steady cadence of conversation. Michael answered my knock, looking marginally better than he had 3 days ago, less exhausted, more like the teenager he was supposed to be. "Sarah," he said, surprise and pleasure mingling in his voice. "Dad's in the kitchen. We were just about to have dinner." I followed him through the small living room, noticing other subtle changes: cleared coffee table, vacuumed carpet, a vase of inexpensive flowers on the side table. The kitchen, too, was transformed. Clean counters, no dishes in the sink, and Robert standing at the stove stirring something that smelled surprisingly good. He turned when I entered, and I was struck by the difference in him. Still thin, still tired looking, but clear-eyed and present in a way he hadn't been before. "Sarah," he said, wiping his hands on a dish towel, "we weren't expecting you." "I said I'd check in," I replied, setting the grocery bag on the counter. "Just brought a few things. Nothing special." An awkward silence fell, the kind that happens when people who have shared an intense experience try to interact under normal circumstances. I'd seen Robert at his absolute worst. Unconscious, vulnerable, broken. He'd revealed his deepest failures to me, a stranger. That knowledge hung between us now, uncomfortable and raw. "It smells great in here," I said, breaking the tension. "What are you making?" "Chili," he answered, turning back to the pot. "Nothing fancy, but it was Claire's recipe, Michael's favorite." I caught the look that passed between father and son, something weighted with memory and meaning I wasn't privy to. "I called that first number," Robert continued, stirring the pot. "The counseling center. I have an appointment tomorrow, and I found a grief support group that meets at the community center on Thursdays." "That's great," I said, genuinely impressed. "Really great, Robert." "Dad's been sober for 3 days," Michael added, a cautious pride in his voice. Robert's shoulders tensed slightly. "One day at a time, right? That's what they say." The phrase, so common in recovery circles, struck me as both hopeful and fragile. 3 days was nothing in the grand scheme of addiction, but it was also everything, the beginning of a possible path forward. Would you like to stay for dinner? Michael asked. There's plenty. I hesitated, aware I was intruding on their tentative reconnection, but also genuinely hungry after a long shift at the hospital. If you're sure there's enough. Definitely, Robert said, not meeting my eyes. It's the least we can do. Dinner was surprisingly comfortable. Michael carried most of the conversation, talking about school, a science project he was working on, a movie he wanted to see. Robert listened attentively, asking questions, present in a way that seemed new and precious to his son. I watched their interaction, noticing the careful way they moved around certain topics, the moments when grief brushed too close and they both retreated slightly before regrouping. After we'd cleared the plates, Michael excused himself to finish homework, leaving Robert and me alone at the kitchen table with cups of coffee. Thank you, he said quietly, staring into his mug, for not reporting us, for giving me another chance. You're doing the work, I replied. That's what matters. He nodded, then seemed to gather himself for something difficult. There's something I need to tell you, about why things got so bad. Robert, you don't owe me explanations. Maybe not, but I need to say this. He took a deep breath. When Claire died, it wasn't just losing my wife. There were complications. Things I blame myself for. I waited, sensing he needed to tell this story at his own pace. She'd been sick for months before we knew it was cancer, tired all the time, losing weight. I kept telling her to see a doctor, but we didn't have good insurance and she was worried about the cost. His voice grew hoarse. By the time she finally went, it was everywhere. Terminal. 6 months, maybe, they said. I'd seen this scenario play out too many times in my career. Treatable conditions becoming death sentences because of delayed care, often due to financial concerns. She fought hard, Robert continued. Harder than I could have. But near the end, she made me promise something. He paused, swallowing hard. She made me promise I'd take care of Michael, that I wouldn't let what happened to her happen to him. And you feel you've broken that promise, I said softly. He nodded, eyes bright with unshed tears. Every day, every time I reach for the pills or the bottle, I'm breaking my word to her. But it's the only way I know to make it through the day without her. Grief isn't linear, I said, thinking of my own experiences. An addiction complicates everything, but you're taking steps now, that matters. There's more, he said, his voice dropping even lower. Something I've never told anyone, not even Michael. He glanced toward the hallway, making sure his son was out of earshot. The night before Claire died, I was supposed to be with her at the hospital, but I couldn't. I couldn't watch her suffer anymore. I went to a bar instead. The confession hung in the air between us, heavy with self-loathing. When I got back to the hospital the next morning, she was already gone, died alone in the middle of the night while I was passed out drunk in my car. His voice broke. How do I live with that? How do I look at my son every day knowing I wasn't there when his mother needed me most? The raw pain in his voice reached something deep inside me, a recognition of the terrible weight of regret, of moments we can never take back. Robert, I said carefully, I can't absolve you of that. No one can. But punishing yourself by slowly destroying what's left of your life won't change what happened. It only creates new regrets, new pain, for you and for Michael. He nodded, wiping roughly at his eyes. I know. Logically, I know that. But sometimes the guilt is so heavy I can't breathe under it. That's what the counseling is for, I said. That's why you talk about it, work through it. Not to make it go away. It never will completely. But to learn to carry it without being crushed by it. He looked at me then, really looked at me, as if seeing beyond the nurse who had invaded his home to the person underneath. You sound like you're speaking from experience. It was my turn to look away. We all have regrets, Robert. Things we wish we could change. What's yours? He asked quietly. The question caught me off guard. In my professional life, I was used to being the one who listened, who helped, who supported. Patients didn't ask about my pain, my regrets. That's a conversation for another time, I said, standing up. It's getting late, and you both need rest. He accepted the deflection with a nod, walking me to the door. Will you come back? Check on us again? The vulnerability in the question touched me. Yes, in a few days. As I drove home through the quiet streets, Robert's confession echoed in my mind. Not because it was shocking, I'd heard similar stories of regret and guilt from countless patients over the years, but because of how closely it mirrored my own unspoken shame. I hadn't told Robert about my last conversation with David, the night before he left. How he'd begged me to really see him, to acknowledge the emptiness that had grown between us. How I'd dismissed his pain, too wrapped up in my own carefully constructed routine to recognize the desperation in his eyes. How the last words I'd said to my husband of 22 years were, "If you're so unhappy, then leave." And he had. I hadn't told Robert how Jason, then 17, had looked at me with accusation in his eyes for months afterward, how he'd chosen a college as far from home as possible, how our weekly calls had become exercises in careful avoidance, neither of us mentioning the fracture in our family that I had helped create. Some regrets we keep to ourselves, I thought, turning onto my street. Some guilt we carry alone. What I didn't know then was that the connections between Robert's family and mine ran deeper than shared regret. That in the coming days, a discovery in their attic would unearth a secret that would force me to question everything I thought I knew about my own past, about the careful story I'd constructed to explain the emptiness in my life. And that secret would begin with a dusty box of photographs and a name I hadn't heard in 30 years. I kept my promise to check on Robert and Michael, stopping by every few days with groceries or takeout, staying for dinner, helping Michael with his homework when Robert had support group meetings. It became a routine, a welcome break from the silence of my own house. I told myself I was just fulfilling my professional obligation to make sure they were okay, but the truth was more complicated. In their company, I felt needed in a way I hadn't in years. Robert was making progress, attending counseling, staying sober, reconnecting with his son. There were bad days, of course. Days when I'd arrive to find him red-eyed and withdrawn, the weight of his grief pressing him into silence. But even on those days, he was trying. The pills remained in their bottles, the liquor cabinet stayed empty. It was on one of those difficult days, about 3 weeks after my first visit, that everything changed. I'd brought pizza, sensing from Robert's subdued greeting that cooking would be too much for him that evening. Michael was unusually quiet too, picking at his food without his usual teenage appetite. "Everything okay at school?" I asked him, trying to break the heavy silence. He shrugged. "It's fine, just a lot of homework." "Michael has a family history project due," Robert explained, making a visible effort to engage. "He's been avoiding it." "It's stupid," Michael muttered. "We're supposed to make a family tree, bring in old photos, talk about where our ancestors came from. Everyone else has grandparents to interview, cousins, family stories. We don't have any of that." The pain in his voice was palpable. Claire's death had not only taken his mother, but had severed his connection to an entire family history. "What about your side, Robert?" I asked gently. "Surely there are some stories, some photos?" A shadow crossed his face. "Not much. My parents died when I was young. I was raised in foster care, like I told you. Never knew much about my family background." "There might be something in the attic," Michael said suddenly. "Mom kept boxes of stuff up there. Maybe there are photos?" Robert looked uncomfortable. "I don't think—" "Please, Dad," Michael interrupted. "I need something for this project, just to look normal for once." The naked plea in his voice seemed to pierce Robert's resistance. He sighed heavily. "Fine. We can look after dinner." The attic was accessed through a pull-down ladder in the hallway ceiling. Robert went up first, switching on a bare bulb that cast long shadows across the dusty space. Michael and I followed, emerging into a low-ceilinged room filled with the usual attic detritus. Holiday decorations, old furniture, boxes labeled in neat handwriting that must have been Claire's. "Over there," Robert said, pointing to a stack of plastic bins. "Those are the family photos and papers. Claire was the organized one." Michael immediately went to the bins, opening the top one with eager hands. Inside were photo albums, their covers faded with age. He pulled one out and opened it reverently, as if handling a sacred text. "Mom as a kid," he said softly, showing me a photo of a smiling girl with dark braids. "And these are her parents, my grandparents. I barely remember them. They died when I was little." I watched as he turned the pages, his face softening with each photograph. Robert stood slightly apart, his expression a complex mixture of love and pain as he watched his son reconnect with these memories. "What about your family, Dad?" Michael asked eventually, looking up. "Is there anything here from your side?" Robert hesitated. "I don't think so. Like I said, I don't have much family history to share." "But Mom would have kept something, right? She kept everything." Michael moved to another bin, this one labeled Robert, personal. "Michael, I don't think," Robert started, but Michael was already opening it. Inside were folders, a few books, what looked like school records. Michael pulled out a manila envelope and opened it, revealing a small stack of photographs. "See? I knew Mom would have saved something." He began looking through them. "Is this you as a kid, Dad?" Robert moved closer, reluctance in every step. "Let me see." I stayed back, feeling like an intruder in this family moment, but curious despite myself. Robert took the photos from Michael, flipping through them with increasing tension in his shoulders. "These aren't mine," he said finally. "I don't know where Claire got these." "What do you mean?" Michael asked, confused. "That looks like you." He pointed to a photo in Robert's hand. I couldn't help myself. I moved closer to see. The photograph showed a young boy, perhaps 8 or 9, with dark hair and serious eyes, standing next to a woman whose face was partially turned away from the camera. "That's not me," Robert said, his voice strangely flat. "I don't know who this is." "Let me see the others," Michael said, reaching for the stack. Robert hesitated, then handed them over. Michael spread them on the dusty attic floor, arranging them like pieces of a puzzle. Most showed the same boy at different ages, sometimes alone, sometimes with adults whose faces were often blurred or turned away. "These were in your personal box, Dad," Michael insisted. "They must be you." "They're not," Robert repeated, but there was something in his voice now, a tension that hadn't been there before. "Claire must have. I don't know why she kept these." I was about to suggest we go back downstairs, give them privacy for what was clearly becoming a difficult conversation, when Michael pulled something else from the envelope, a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. "What's this?" he murmured, unfolding it carefully. Robert reached for it. "Michael, that's enough. This isn't helping with your project." But Michael had already opened the paper. "It's a birth certificate," he said, scanning it. Then his face changed, confusion clouding his features. "Dad, this has your name on it, but the parents' names are different. And the place of birth." Robert snatched the paper from his hands, his face draining of color as he read it. "This isn't mine. It's a mistake." "Robert?" I said, concerned by the sudden change in him. "Are you okay?" He looked up at me, and the raw panic in his eyes sent a chill through me. "We need to go downstairs, now." "But Dad," Michael began. "Now, Michael!" The sharpness in his voice was so unlike him that Michael immediately stood, shooting me a confused, worried glance. We descended from the attic in tense silence, Robert clutching the birth certificate and photographs in a white-knuckled grip. In the living room, he paced back and forth while Michael and I sat on the couch, watching him with growing concern. "Robert, what's going on?" I asked finally, unable to bear the tension any longer. He stopped pacing, staring at the papers in his hand as if they might burn him. "I don't know," he said, his voice barely audible. "I don't understand why Claire would have these." "Have what?" Michael pressed. "Dad, you're scaring me." Robert sank into an armchair, suddenly looking exhausted beyond measure. "The birth certificate. It has my name on it, but—" He swallowed hard. "The parents listed aren't the people I was told were my parents." "What do you mean?" Michael asked. "I told you I was raised in foster care. My parents, the people I was told were my parents, died in a car accident when I was 3. I have no memory of them." He looked down at the paper. "But this birth certificate lists different names, people I've never heard of." The implications hung in the air, unspoken but enormous. "Could it be a mistake?" I suggested gently. "A clerical error?" "Then why would Claire have it? Why would she keep it hidden in a box in the attic?" He ran a hand through his hair, distress evident in every movement. "And these photos? I've never seen them before, but the boy does look like me, like I might have looked as a child." Michael moved to sit on the arm of his father's chair, placing a tentative hand on his shoulder. Maybe Mom was researching your family history, trying to find information for you? Without telling me? Robert shook his head. Claire and I didn't have secrets. Not like this. I watched them, father and son united in confusion, and felt a strange unease growing in my stomach. Something about the situation, the hidden documents, the mysterious photographs, triggered a distant memory, a conversation overheard long ago that I couldn't quite place. May I see the birth certificate? I asked, extending my hand. Robert hesitated, then passed it to me. The paper was fragile with age, the typing faded, but still legible. Robert James Harlow, born April 12, 1972. Parents: Thomas Harlow and... My heart stopped as I read the mother's name. Catherine Donovan Harlow. Donovan, my maiden name. This can't be right, I whispered, my fingers suddenly numb. Sarah? Robert's voice seemed to come from far away. What is it? I looked up at him, really looked at him, seeing his features as if for the first time. The shape of his eyes, the line of his jaw, the way his left eyebrow rose slightly higher than his right when he was concerned, just as it was now, just like my father's had. Catherine Donovan was my aunt, I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth. My father's sister. She disappeared when I was a child. The family never spoke of her. Robert stared at me, incomprehension giving way to shock. What are you saying? I'm saying, I replied, my voice steadier than I felt, that if this birth certificate is real, we might be related. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. In that moment, the world seemed to shift beneath me, reality rearranging itself into a pattern I couldn't yet comprehend. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that this discovery was only the beginning, that the truth behind Robert's origins and my aunt's disappearance would uncover a family secret so carefully buried that its revelation would shake the foundations of everything I believed about my family, my childhood, and myself. A secret that would ultimately lead to both devastation and healing for all of us. The revelation hung in the air like smoke, choking and disorienting. Robert stared at me, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. Michael looked between us, trying to process the implications of what I'd just said. Related? Robert finally managed. That's impossible. But even as he denied it, I could see him studying my face, looking for similarities, connections, the same way I was studying his. I need to make a call, I said, standing abruptly. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone. Excuse me for a minute. I stepped onto the front porch, the cool evening air a shock against my flushed skin. The number I dialed was one I rarely used, my father's younger brother, Uncle James, the family historian and keeper of secrets. He answered on the fourth ring. Sarah, is everything okay? I need to ask you something, I said without preamble. About Aunt Catherine. A long pause. Why are you asking about Catherine after all these years? I found something, someone. I took a deep breath. Uncle James, did Catherine have a child before she disappeared? The silence that followed was answer enough. You knew, I whispered. The family knew she had a child. Sarah, he sighed heavily. This is a conversation we should have in person, not over the phone. I'm standing on the porch of a man named Robert Harlow, I said, my voice gaining strength. I'm looking at a birth certificate that lists Catherine Donovan Harlow as his mother. I need to know if that's true. Another long pause. Yes, he finally said, his voice heavy with resignation. Catherine had a son. The family, your grandfather, they didn't approve of her marriage. Thomas Harlow wasn't considered suitable. When they died in that accident, the family decided it was better for the boy to be raised elsewhere. Clean slate, they said. The casual cruelty of it stole my breath. They abandoned him to foster care, their own blood? It wasn't that simple, Sarah. There were circumstances. What? Circumstances could possibly justify abandoning a 3-year-old child? The anger in my voice surprised even me. Your grandfather made the decision. No one questioned him in those days. And my father? Did he know? Uncle James's hesitation told me everything. He disagreed with the decision. It caused a rift in the family. That's why we never spoke of Catherine or her child. It was... Easier that way. Easier, I repeated, the word bitter on my tongue. I need to go. I'll call you tomorrow. I hung up before he could respond, leaning against the porch railing as the implications washed over me. My family, my own father, had known about Robert all along, had allowed him to grow up believing he was alone in the world when he had aunts, uncles, cousins, when he had me. I returned to the living room, where Robert and Michael waited in tense silence. They looked up as I entered, questions in both their eyes. "It's true," I said simply. "Catherine was my aunt, my father's sister." Robert stood up, then sat back down, as if his legs wouldn't support him. "How is that possible? How could you just happen to pick up Michael on the highway, just happen to come to our house? This can't be coincidence." "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't have answers yet, but I'm going to find them." Michael looked between us, his young face serious. "So you and Dad are… what? Cousins?" "First cousins once removed, I think," I said, the technical term absurdly inadequate for the emotional reality we were facing. "Robert, I had no idea. None. I was told Catherine ran away. The family never spoke of her." "And they never spoke of me," he said, his voice hollow. "I grew up thinking I had no one, bouncing between foster homes, never belonging anywhere." He looked up, anger flashing in his eyes. "Why? Why would they do that?" "I don't know yet," I said, "but I'm going to find out." The three of us sat there, bound by a truth none of us had been prepared for, trying to make sense of a past suddenly revealed to be built on lies. Eventually, Michael fell asleep on the couch, emotionally exhausted. Robert covered him with a blanket, his movements gentle despite the turmoil evident on his face. "I should go," I said quietly. "Give you space to process this." "No," Robert said quickly. "Please, I have questions, so many questions." We moved to the kitchen to avoid waking Michael, sitting across from each other at the small table where we'd shared meals these past weeks, now strangers again in the wake of this revelation. "Tell me about her," Robert said. "My mother." The request was so simple, so fundamental, that it broke my heart. "I barely remember her. I was only 7 when she disappeared. When she died, I guess. She was my father's younger sister. Beautiful, from the photos I've seen. Dark hair like yours, like Michael's." "Was she kind?" he asked, his voice catching. "I think so. I remember her laughing a lot, bringing me presents for no reason. My father always seemed happier when she was around." I hesitated. "Robert, I'm so sorry. I can't believe my family did this to you." He shook his head. "It wasn't you. You didn't know. But they did. They knew, and they chose to leave you in the system rather than take responsibility for their own flesh and blood." The anger I felt toward my family, toward my father who had died 5 years ago without ever revealing this secret, was a living thing in my chest. "What happens now?" Robert asked, looking lost. "I don't know," I admitted. "This is overwhelming. For both of us. All these weeks, you've been helping us, checking on us, bringing food. And all along, you were family." He gave a bitter laugh. "The universe has a sick sense of humor." "Maybe it's not coincidence," I said slowly, thinking aloud. "Maybe it's, I don't know, something bringing us together, fixing what was broken." He looked skeptical. "You believe in that kind of thing? Fate?" "I don't know what I believe anymore." I rubbed my temples, feeling a headache building. "But the odds of me picking up Michael that night, of all people, it seems impossible." We sat in silence for a moment, both overwhelmed by the implications. "There's something else," Robert said finally. "Something I haven't told you." He took a deep breath. "The night you found me, with the pills, it wasn't the first time. After Claire died, I tried to. I couldn't see a way forward without her. I took pills then too. Ended up in the hospital." I waited, sensing there was more to the story. "While I was there, semi-conscious, I had this vision, I guess. Claire was there, telling me I had to stay, that Michael needed me, that someone was coming who would help us both." He looked embarrassed. "I wrote it off as a hallucination from the drugs. But then you showed up, a stranger who just happened to help my son, who just happened to be a nurse, who just happened to be related to me." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. You think Claire somehow arranged this? From beyond? It sounds crazy when you say it out loud, he admitted. But I can't shake the feeling that she knew. Somehow, she knew about my real family. Those photos, that birth certificate. She must have been researching my background. Maybe she was planning to tell me when she got better. When she realized she wouldn't get better. He trailed off. You think she's been guiding this whole thing? I asked, not sure if I found the idea comforting or unsettling. I don't know what I think anymore, he said, echoing my earlier words. I just know that having you show up in our lives doesn't feel like random chance. I thought about the emptiness I'd been feeling in my own life, the restlessness that had been growing for months before I picked up Michael that rainy night. Had some unseen force been pushing me toward this moment, this discovery? Whatever brought us together, I said finally. We're here now. We're family. That means something. Does it? He asked, vulnerability raw in his voice. What does family mean when yours threw me away? When mine might not even be mine? The question hung between us, unanswerable in the moment. We were two people suddenly connected by blood, but separated by decades of different lives, different experiences. The bridge between us was fragile, built on a foundation of shared shock rather than shared history. I should go, I said again, standing. This is a lot to process, for both of us. Robert nodded, looking exhausted. Will you come back? The uncertainty in his voice broke my heart all over again. Of course I will. We're going to figure this out together. I promise. As I drove home through the quiet streets, my mind raced with questions, with anger, with a strange sense of wonder. The universe had conspired to bring me to Robert and Michael, to reveal a family secret buried for decades. But why now? What purpose did this revelation serve after so many years? I didn't know then that the answer to that question would force me to confront the deepest wounds in my own life, the failure of my marriage, the distance between me and my son, the carefully constructed walls I'd built to protect myself from pain. I didn't know that in helping Robert discover his past, I would finally have to face the truth about my own present. And I certainly didn't know that the most shocking revelation was yet to come, a truth so carefully hidden that its discovery would either destroy us all or finally set us free. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls, research, and emotional conversations. I contacted Uncle James again, pressing for more details about Catherine and her child. He was reluctant at first, the family habit of secrecy deeply ingrained, but eventually agreed to send me what information he had: old photographs, letters, the few personal effects of Catherine's that had been preserved. Your father wanted to take the boy, Uncle James told me during one particularly difficult call. He fought with your grandfather about it, but in the end, he gave in. He always regretted it, Sarah. It haunted him. The knowledge that my father had wanted to do the right thing but failed brought me little comfort. I remembered him as a kind man, but one who rarely stood up to his own domineering father. That weakness had cost Robert his family, his history, his sense of belonging. I shared what I learned with Robert in careful doses, mindful of the emotional impact each revelation had on him. He alternated between anger, grief, and a desperate hunger for information about the parents he couldn't remember. Michael, with the resilience of youth, seemed to adapt more quickly to the idea that I was family, asking questions about his newfound relatives with cautious enthusiasm. So I have other cousins? He asked one evening as we sat in their living room, looking through the materials Uncle James had sent. Like actual blood relatives? Yes, I said, smiling at his excitement. My son Jason would be your second cousin, and I have cousins with children about your age. Third cousins to you, I think. Cool, he said, examining a photo of the extended Donovan family taken at a reunion years ago. They look normal. Robert watched his son with a mixture of joy and pain. You always wanted a big family, he said softly. Your mom did too. I looked at Robert, seeing the conflict in his eyes. This doesn't change who you are, I said gently. Learning about the Donovans doesn't erase the life you've built, the family you created with Claire. Doesn't it? He asked. Everything I thought I knew about myself is a lie. Even my name might not be real. Robert Harlow is the name on your birth certificate, I pointed out. That much is real. But who were they? My parents? What were they like? Why did the family disapprove of them so much? The questions tumbled out, urgent and painful. I hesitated. Uncle James had been vague about Thomas Harlow, saying only that he wasn't from the right background and that the marriage had been impulsive and ill-advised. Catherine had apparently met him while away at college and married him against her family's wishes. I'm still trying to find out more, I said. Uncle James isn't being very forthcoming about your father. Of course not, Robert said bitterly. Why start being honest now, after 50 years of lies? Michael looked up from the photographs, concern on his young face. Dad, maybe we should take a break. This is a lot. Robert softened immediately, as he always did for his son. You're right. I'm sorry. It's just overwhelming. I know, Michael said with a wisdom beyond his years. But we're figuring it out together, all three of us. The simple inclusion warmed something in me. This acknowledgement that we were now a unit, bound by blood and circumstance and choice. In just a few weeks, these two had become central to my life, in a way I couldn't have imagined. The empty house I returned to each night felt increasingly like a way station rather than a home. That night, as I was preparing to leave, Robert walked me to my car. I called my counselor today, he said. Told her everything, about the pills, about finding out about my family, about you. That's good, I said. What did she say? That it's a lot to process at once, that I need to be careful about my sobriety with all this emotional upheaval. He looked up at the night sky. She also said something that's been on my mind. She said sometimes the universe puts people in our path exactly when we need them most. I thought about the rainy night I'd picked up Michael, how close I'd come to driving past. Maybe she's right. I've been thinking about what you said, about this not changing who I am. He hesitated. But it does change things, Sarah. It changes everything to know I wasn't unwanted by everyone. That my mother loved me enough to keep photos, documents, that she didn't just abandon me. No, I agreed. From what little I've learned, Catherine loved you very much. The accident that killed her and your father was just that. An accident. A tragedy. And after? When your family decided I wasn't worth keeping? The hurt in his voice was palpable. That was wrong. Unforgivably wrong. I touched his arm gently. But it doesn't reflect on your worth, Robert. It reflects on their failings, their prejudices. He nodded, not entirely convinced but willing to consider it. There's something else I've been meaning to ask you, he said, changing the subject. Something personal. What is it? That night in my kitchen, when I asked about your regrets, you changed the subject, but I've seen it in your eyes sometimes, the same kind of pain I feel about Claire. What happened to you, Sarah? What broke your heart? The directness of the question took me aback. In our weeks of growing closeness, I'd carefully kept the focus on him and Michael, on their needs, their healing. No one had asked about my pain in so long that I'd almost forgotten it was visible to others. My marriage ended, I said simply. 8 years ago. I'm sorry, he said. Was it sudden? I laughed without humor. Yes and no. David had been unhappy for years, but I didn't see it, or didn't want to see it. I was so wrapped up in my work, in my routines. He said he felt invisible in his own home. That must have been hard. The worst part was what it did to Jason, my son. He was 17 when David left, old enough to understand, young enough to be devastated. He blamed me. Still does, I think. Is that why he's across the country? To get away from the fallout? The insight surprised me. Maybe. We talk every week, but it's surface, polite, nothing real. You miss him, Robert said. It wasn't a question. Every day. The admission felt like releasing a breath I'd been holding for years. I threw myself into work after David left, told myself I was fine on my own. But lately, I trailed off, unsure how to articulate the emptiness that had been growing inside me. Lately, you've been wondering what it was all for, Robert finished for me. the sacrifices, the long hours, the putting everyone else first. You're wondering what's left for you." I stared at him, startled by how accurately he'd read me. "Yes, exactly. I felt the same way after Claire died," he said quietly. "Like I'd been running on a treadmill for years, and suddenly it stopped, and I had no idea where I was or why I'd been running in the first place." We stood in silence for a moment, two middle-aged people who had lost their way for different reasons but found themselves in the same place, adrift, searching for meaning, for connection. "Maybe that's the real reason we found each other," I said finally. "Not just because of Catherine and the family secret, but because we both needed something, someone." Robert nodded slowly. "Maybe so." As I drove home that night, our conversation replayed in my mind. For weeks, I'd been focused on helping Robert and Michael, on uncovering the truth about our shared family history. But perhaps they had been helping me too, drawing me out of my isolation, forcing me to engage with life again, to feel something beyond the comfortable numbness I'd wrapped around myself like armor. The next day, I did something I'd been avoiding for years. I called my son and told him everything about finding Michael, about discovering Robert was my cousin, about the family secret that had been kept from us all. But most importantly, I told him about my regrets. "I'm sorry, Jason," I said, my voice breaking. "I'm sorry I wasn't the mother you needed after your father left. I'm sorry I retreated into work instead of being present for you." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Mom," he finally said, his voice gentler than I'd heard it in years. "I've been waiting a long time to hear you say that." It was the beginning of a real conversation, the first of many that would slowly rebuild the bridge between us. And it happened because Robert had asked the question no one else had been brave enough to ask. "What broke your heart?" What I didn't know then was that the healing beginning in all our lives, Robert's sobriety, Michael's newfound sense of family, my reconnection with Jason, the uncovering of long-buried truths, was about to be threatened by one final, devastating revelation. A secret so carefully hidden that its discovery would test the fragile bonds we were forming and force us all to decide what family truly means. A secret hidden in the last place any of us would think to look. In plain sight, in my own home. The call came on a Tuesday morning, just as I was leaving for my shift at the hospital. Uncle James, his voice tense with what sounded like a mixture of dread and resignation. "I found something," he said without preamble. "Something about Thomas Harlow, Robert's father. I think you should come over before you share it with him." "I'm about to start work," I said, checking my watch. "Can it wait until this evening?" "No," he replied, the firmness in his tone surprising me. "Call in sick if you have to. This is important, Sarah. More important than you know." The urgency in his voice sent a chill through me. "I'll be there in 30 minutes. Uncle James lived in the family home, a sprawling Victorian on the outskirts of town that had been in the Donovan family for generations. As I pulled into the circular driveway, I was struck by how imposing it looked. A physical manifestation of the family's wealth and status, the very things that had apparently made Thomas Harlow unsuitable in my grandfather's eyes. Uncle James met me at the door, looking older and more tired than I'd seen him in years. At 78, he was the last of his generation, the keeper of family history, both glorious and shameful. "Thank you for coming," he said, leading me to his study, a book-lined room that smelled of leather and pipe tobacco, though he'd given up smoking years ago. "I've been going through the attic, looking for anything related to Catherine and her husband." "And you found something?" I prompted when he paused, seating himself heavily behind his desk. He nodded, opening a drawer and removing a manila envelope similar to the one we'd found in Robert's attic. "These were in a locked box in your grandfather's personal effects. I never had reason to look through them before." He slid the envelope across the desk. I opened it with fingers that had suddenly gone cold, pulling out several photographs and what appeared to be newspaper clippings. The first photograph showed a young man with dark hair and a charming smile, his arm around a woman I recognized as my Aunt Catherine from family albums. They looked happy, in love, their youth and vitality radiating from the faded image. "Thomas Harlow?" I asked, looking up at Uncle James. He nodded grimly. "Keep going." The next photograph was of the same man, but in a different context. A group shot of young men in what looked like a college setting, arms around each other's shoulders, laughing at the camera. I studied it, not understanding its significance until I noticed the handwritten caption at the bottom. Lakeside University Debate Team, 1970. Lakeside, the town where I lived, where I'd lived for the past 18 years. Catherine met him at college, I said slowly. Here? In Lakeside? Yes, Uncle James confirmed. She was studying nursing. He was pre-law. I continued through the materials, finding more photographs, letters, and finally the newspaper clippings. The first was a wedding announcement. Catherine Donovan weds Thomas Harlow in private ceremony. The second, dated 2 years later, made my blood run cold. Local attorney and wife die in car accident. Infant son survives. But it wasn't the headline that stopped my breath. It was the photograph accompanying the article. A grainy image of the accident scene, with a smaller inset photo of Thomas Harlow. The same charming smile, the same dark hair, the same face I'd seen every day for 22 years of marriage. The same face my son had inherited. No, I whispered, the word inadequate for the tidal wave of shock crashing over me. This can't be right. I'm afraid it is, Uncle James said quietly. Thomas Harlow didn't die in that accident, Sarah. He survived. And years later, he changed his name to David Marshall. He married you without ever revealing his true identity. David, my ex-husband, Robert's father, which meant... Robert is Jason's half-brother, I said, the words sounding strange and impossible in my mouth. But that would mean David knew. He knew he had another son and never said anything. Never looked for him. Uncle James nodded gravely. It appears so. But how? Why? My mind struggled to process the magnitude of the deception. The accident was real? Yes. Catherine died instantly. Thomas, David, was injured but recovered. The official report said the baby died too, but obviously that wasn't true. Your grandfather must have arranged for Robert to be listed as deceased, then placed in foster care. And David just accepted that? Let his own son be taken away? The betrayal was so enormous I could barely comprehend it. I don't know what threats or inducements your grandfather used, Uncle James said. He was a powerful man with many connections. Perhaps David was young, injured, grieving his wife. Perhaps he was offered money to disappear, start a new life. And he chose me, of all people? The coincidence was too great, too cruel to be random. Did he know who I was when we met? Uncle James hesitated. I can't say for certain, but given that he changed his name, moved away, then returned to Lakeside years later, and married into the very family that had taken his son, he shrugged. It seems unlikely to be mere chance. The implications crashed over me in waves. David had known all along, had possibly married me because of my connection to the Donovans, had fathered a son with me while his firstborn grew up in foster care, unwanted and alone. Does Robert know? I asked, my voice hollow. About David? Not from me, Uncle James replied. I only made the connection yesterday when I found these photographs. I sat in stunned silence, trying to process the revelation. Everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, seemed suddenly false. Had any of it been real? Had David ever loved me? Or had I been merely a means to an end? Revenge against the family that had taken his son, perhaps? Or something more complex, a way to stay connected to Catherine? What are you going to do? Uncle James asked after a long moment. I don't know, I admitted. This changes everything. Robert, Michael, Jason, this will affect all of them. How do I tell them that they're not cousins but brothers? That the father who abandoned Robert is the same man who raised Jason? Perhaps you don't, Uncle James suggested carefully. Some secrets are better left buried, Sarah. I looked at him in disbelief. That's what the family said about Robert 50 years ago. Look how that turned out. No, I can't keep this from them. They deserve the truth no matter how painful. And David? Will you confront him? The question sent a fresh wave of anger through me. Yes, he owes us all an explanation. I gathered the photographs and clippings, sliding them back into the envelope with hands that shook with emotion. Thank you for telling me, Uncle James, for not hiding this like the family hid everything else. He nodded, looking suddenly very old. I'm tired of secrets, Sarah. They poison everything they touch. As I drove home, my mind raced with questions, with fury, with an overwhelming sense of betrayal. David had lived a double life in ways I couldn't begin to comprehend. He had abandoned his firstborn son, married into the family responsible for taking that son away, fathered another child, and kept his secrets for decades. And now I had to decide how to tell two brothers, one who had grown up believing he was alone in the world, the other who had no idea his father was capable of such deception, that they shared a father neither of them truly knew. But first, I had to confront David himself. I pulled into my driveway, went inside, and picked up my phone. With fingers that still trembled with shock and rage, I dialed the number of the man who had shared my bed, my home, my life, for 22 years. The man I thought I had known better than anyone. Sarah? His voice, so familiar yet suddenly strange, answered after 3 rings. Is everything okay? You never call during the day. No, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. Everything is not okay. We need to talk, David. About Thomas Harlow. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. David arrived at my house, our former home, 6 hours later. He'd been living in Seattle for the past 5 years with his second wife, but had apparently dropped everything and booked the first available flight after my call. That alone confirmed what I already knew. The secret I'd uncovered was real, and he had been keeping it for decades. I watched from the window as he walked up the path to the front door, looking much the same as when he'd left 8 years ago. A little grayer, perhaps, a little heavier, but still handsome in the way that had first attracted me to him all those years ago. The same dark hair and eyes that he'd passed to our son. The same features I now recognized in Robert's face. I opened the door before he could knock. Come in. He stepped inside, his expression a mixture of wariness and resignation. Sarah. Sit down, I said, gesturing to the living room. I'd spent the hours waiting for him in a state of controlled fury, rehearsing what I would say, how I would demand answers. But now that he was here, standing in the home we'd once shared, looking at me with those familiar eyes, I found my carefully prepared speech inadequate. How could you? I asked simply. He sank onto the couch, running a hand through his hair in a gesture so familiar it made my heart ache despite everything. It's complicated, Sarah. Uncomplicate it for me, I replied, remaining standing. Tell me why you abandoned your son, why you married me without telling me who you really were, why you've been living a lie for 50 years. He flinched at each accusation. How did you find out? Does it matter? I know everything, David. Or should I call you Thomas? David, he said quickly. I've been David longer than I was ever Thomas. Fine, David, start talking. He took a deep breath, his shoulders slumping in defeat. I was 22 when Catherine died. We'd been married just over a year. Robert was only 3 months old. He paused, swallowing hard. The accident. I don't remember much of it. I woke up in the hospital. They told me Catherine was gone, that Robert had died too. But he hadn't, I said flatly. You knew that. He nodded slowly. Not at first. I was in the hospital for weeks. By the time I was lucid enough to ask questions, to demand to see my son's body, your grandfather came to visit me. My grandfather? I hadn't expected this detail. Edward Donovan. He told me Robert had survived but was being well cared for, that the Donovan family had decided it would be best for everyone if I disappeared, if Robert was raised elsewhere, without the burden of his parents' tragedy. And you just accepted that? The disbelief in my voice was palpable. You let them take your son? David's face contorted with what looked like genuine pain. You didn't know your grandfather, Sarah. He wasn't just wealthy and powerful. He was ruthless. He made it very clear that if I tried to claim Robert, he would use his influence to have me declared an unfit parent. He had evidence, fabricated, but convincing, that I had been drinking the night of the accident, that I was responsible for Catherine's death. So you walked away, changed your name, started a new life. The coldness in my voice matched the ice forming around my heart. I had no choice, he protested. I was young, injured, grieving. Your grandfather offered me a settlement. Enough money to start over somewhere else, with the condition that I never try to contact Robert or the Donovan family again. But you did contact the family. You married me. The betrayal still felt fresh, a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. He looked away. That was years later. I tried to move on, Sarah. I went to law school in another state, built a practice, dated other women. But I never stopped thinking about my son, about what had been taken from me. So marrying me was what? Revenge against the Donovans? A way to get close to the family that had stolen your child? No! The vehemence in his denial surprised me. When I met you, I had no idea who you were. It was only after we'd been dating for months that you mentioned your maiden name, talked about your family. By then, I was already in love with you. I laughed bitterly. You expect me to believe that? That of all the women in the world, you just happened to fall in love with Edward Donovan's granddaughter? It's the truth, he insisted. When I realized who you were, I almost ended things. But I couldn't. I loved you, Sarah. That was real. If you loved me, you would have told me the truth. About who you were, about Robert. He shook his head. I couldn't risk it. Your family, your father, might have recognized my name. And I'd signed legal documents promising never to reveal what had happened. The settlement came with an ironclad confidentiality agreement. So you married me under false pretenses, had a child with me, lived with me for 22 years without ever telling me you had another son out there somewhere. Each word felt like a stone in my throat. I tried to find him, David said quietly. After your grandfather died, when there was no one left to enforce the agreement, I hired private investigators. But the trail was cold. The records had been sealed or altered. It was as if Robert Harlow had never existed. But he did exist. He does exist. He's been living 30 miles from here all this time, David, working at a mill, raising his son alone after his wife died, struggling with grief and addiction while you built your comfortable life in Seattle with your new wife. The bitterness in my voice was undisguised. David's head snapped up. You found him? Robert is alive? Here? The naked hope and longing in his face gave me pause. Perhaps there was some truth to his story after all, some genuine regret for the son he'd lost. Yes, I said more calmly. I found him, or rather, he found me. It's a long story. I need to see him, David said immediately, standing. Where is he? I have to explain. Sit down, I commanded, and something in my voice made him obey. You don't get to decide that. Robert has been through enough without you barging back into his life making demands. He's my son, Sarah. The son you abandoned, I reminded him harshly. The son you replaced with Jason. He flinched as if I'd slapped him. I never replaced him, not in my heart. I thought about him every day. Every time I looked at Jason, I wondered about Robert, what he looked like, if he was happy, if he ever thought about me. He thought you were dead, I said flatly. He believed he was alone in the world. David's face crumpled. Oh God. We sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of decades of deception hanging between us. Does Jason know? He finally asked. About Robert? Not yet, I admitted. I wanted to hear your side first, understand how this happened. And now that you've heard it, do you believe me? I considered the question carefully. The story he'd told, of a powerful man using his influence to separate a father from his child, of legal threats and confidentiality agreements, was unfortunately plausible. I had never known my grandfather well, but the family stories painted him as exactly the kind of man who would go to any lengths to protect what he saw as the family's interests. I don't know what to believe anymore, I said honestly. But it doesn't change what happens next. Robert and Jason deserve to know the truth. All of it. I want to be there, David said. When you tell them, I need to explain myself. I shook my head. That's not your decision to make. Robert has been through enough trauma. Finding out his father is alive, that he has a half-brother, it needs to be handled carefully. He's going to hate me, David whispered, and the raw pain in his voice almost, made me feel sorry for him. Probably, I agreed. But that's the consequence of the choices you made. Choices that affected all of us. Me, Jason, Robert, even Michael. Michael? Robert's son, your grandson. The words felt strange on my tongue. this connection between us that neither of us had known existed until now. David closed his eyes, absorbing this new information. I have a grandson. A grandson who has never known his paternal grandparents, who is only now beginning to understand his family history. I stood up, indicating our conversation was nearing its end. I need time to figure out how to tell them, David. In the meantime, you need to stay away. For how long? I don't know. That depends on Robert, on what he wants once he knows the truth. David nodded slowly, accepting this boundary even as the pain of it showed clearly on his face. Will you tell me how he is? What his life has been like? The request was so humble, so human, that it pierced through some of my anger. He's had a hard life, David, but he's a good man, a good father. He's trying to put himself back together after losing his wife. He deserves better than what happened to him. Yes, David agreed softly. He does. As I showed him to the door, a question that had been nagging at me finally found voice. When you left me, when you said you needed something more, was it because of this? Because of the secret you'd been keeping? He paused, hand on the doorknob. Partly. Living with the lie, it created a distance I couldn't bridge. Every time I looked at you, I was reminded of what I'd done, what I'd lost. It became unbearable. So you left. Started fresh. Again. He nodded, unable to meet my eyes. I'm sorry, Sarah. For everything. After he was gone, I sat in my quiet house, trying to process everything I'd learned. The man I'd married, the father of my child, had been living a double life all along, grieving a lost wife and son, even as he built a family with me. Our entire marriage had been built on a foundation of secrets and lies. And now I had to find a way to tell two brothers, one who had grown up believing he had no family, the other who had grown up believing he was an only child, that they shared not just blood, but a father whose deceptions had shaped both their lives in ways they were only beginning to understand. The truth, I realized, was going to hurt all of us. But keeping it hidden would be a continuation of the very pattern that had caused so much pain already. The cycle of secrecy had to end, no matter the cost. With that resolution firm in my mind, I picked up my phone and called Robert. It was time for the final revelation, the one that would either destroy the fragile connections we'd been building or become the foundation for something new and stronger. A family forged not just by blood but by choice, by truth, by the shared experience of having survived the lies that had kept us apart for far too long. I asked Robert to meet me at a small park halfway between our homes, a neutral space where we could talk privately. I'd decided not to bring Michael into this conversation yet. Robert deserved to process this revelation on his own first, to decide how and when to share it with his son. He was already waiting when I arrived, sitting on a bench overlooking a small pond, his posture tense as if bracing for bad news. The family resemblance to David, to Jason, was so obvious now that I knew to look for it. The same set of the shoulders, the same profile against the afternoon light. Sarah, he said as I approached, standing to greet me. Your message sounded serious. Is everything okay? Let's sit, I suggested, avoiding the question. I have something to tell you, and it's complicated. We sat side by side on the bench, watching ducks glide across the water's surface. I had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times since David left, but now that the moment was here, all my carefully prepared words deserted me. I found out who your father was, I said finally. Thomas Harlow. Robert tensed beside me. Was. That's where it gets complicated. I took a deep breath. Thomas Harlow didn't die in that car accident with your mother. He survived. Robert turned to stare at me, shock evident in every line of his face. What? But I was told, everyone said... I know. The records were altered. Your grandfather, our grandfather, arranged it all. Made it look like you had died too, then placed you in foster care. But why? Why would he fake my death? Why separate me from my father? The pain and confusion in his voice broke my heart. Because he didn't approve of the marriage, because he thought he was doing what was best for the family. I hesitated. And because he pressured your father into giving you up. My father agreed to this? The betrayal in Robert's voice was raw. He just let them take me away? It's not that simple, I said. though part of me believed it was exactly that simple. A young man choosing the easier path over fighting for his child. He was injured, grieving your mother. Our grandfather threatened him with legal action, accused him of causing the accident, offered him money to disappear, start a new life. And he took it, Robert said flatly. He took the money and left me behind. Yes, I admitted. He did. Robert stood abruptly, pacing in front of the bench, his movements jerky with suppressed emotion. So, my father is alive? All this time he's been out there somewhere, living his life, while I bounced between foster homes thinking I was alone in the world? Yes, I said again, watching him carefully. But there's more, Robert. After the accident, after he gave you up, he changed his name, started a new life. What name? Robert asked, stopping his pacing to look at me. What did he call himself? I met his gaze steadily. David Marshall, for a moment. The name meant nothing to him, just another detail in a story already too painful to fully absorb. Then understanding dawned, horror spreading across his features as he made the connection. Marshall, he repeated. Your married name. You said your ex-husband was named David. His voice rose with each word. Are you telling me that my father, the man who abandoned me, is your ex-husband? I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. And Jason? Your son? The question was barely audible. Is your half-brother? I confirmed. David's son. Robert staggered backward as if physically struck, collapsing back onto the bench. This can't be happening, he whispered. It's too much, too cruel. I know, I said, reaching for his hand. He pulled away, and the rejection stung even though I understood it. I only found out yesterday. I confronted David immediately. He confirmed everything. You spoke to him? To my father? The words seemed to catch in his throat. Yes. He came to see me, to explain his side of things. His side? Robert laughed bitterly. What possible explanation could justify abandoning your own child? None, I said firmly. Nothing justifies what he did, but I thought you deserved to know the whole story. I told him everything David had told me, about the accident, the hospital, my grandfather's threats and offers, the confidentiality agreement, the failed attempts to find Robert years later. As I spoke, Robert's expression cycled through disbelief, anger, pain, and finally a terrible, hollow acceptance. So he married you without telling you any of this? He asked when I finished. Built a whole new family while I grew up thinking I was unwanted? Yes, I said simply. He lied to all of us, Robert. Me, you, Jason. We've all been victims of his deception. Jason, he repeated, as if testing the name. My brother. Does he know? Not yet. I wanted to tell you first, give you time to process before bringing him into this. Robert nodded, staring out at the pond with unfocused eyes. My whole life I wondered about my parents. Who they were, what they were like, why I couldn't remember them. And now to find out my father was alive all along, raising another son. His voice broke. It's like losing him all over again, except this time it's worse because it was a choice. He chose to leave me behind. I sat silently beside him, offering my presence without words, knowing nothing I could say would ease this pain. I keep thinking about Michael, he continued after a long moment. How he's going to take this, finding out he has an uncle, a grandfather he never knew existed. We'll help him through it, I promised. All of us, together. Robert looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time since I'd revealed the truth. Why are you still here, Sarah? After everything you've learned, about David, about my connection to your family, why haven't you walked away from this mess? The Sesika question caught me off guard. Because we're family, I said simply. Not just by blood, but by choice now too. Because in the middle of all these lies and secrets, something true has emerged, a connection between us that matters. Even though every time you look at me, you must see him, the man who betrayed you? I shook my head firmly. That's not what I see, Robert. I see you, a good man who's been dealt a terrible hand but keeps trying anyway, a devoted father, a cousin who became a friend. He seemed to consider this, some of the tension easing from his shoulders. What happens now, with David? Does he want to meet me? He does, I admitted. But that's entirely your decision. You don't owe him anything, Robert. Not your time, not your forgiveness, nothing. And Jason? That's more complicated, I acknowledged. He deserves to know he has a brother, but how that relationship develops, if it develops, is up to the two of you. Robert nodded slowly, processing. I need time to think about all this, to figure out how to tell Michael. Of course, I agreed. Take all the time you need. I'm here, whatever you decide. As we parted ways, Robert paused, turning back to me with a vulnerability that reminded me painfully of Michael. Thank you, he said quietly, for telling me the truth, for not keeping secrets like the rest of them. Always, I promised. No more secrets between us, ever. I watched him walk to his car, shoulders bowed under the weight of revelations that would have broken a lesser man. In that moment, I felt a fierce pride in this newfound cousin of mine, this brother to my son, this man who had endured so much, yet still found the strength to face each new challenge with dignity. The road ahead would not be easy for any of us. There would be more difficult conversations, more pain to work through, more adjustments to our understanding of family and belonging. But for the first time, I felt a cautious hope that something good might emerge from the tangled web of secrets and lies that had shaped all our lives. A week later, that hope was tested when Robert called to tell me he was ready to meet his brother, and perhaps the father who had abandoned him half a century ago. The meeting took place in my living room, neutral territory for all involved. Jason had flown in from California after I'd called him with the incredible news that he had a half-brother. His reaction had surprised me. Shock, yes, and anger at his father's deception, but also a quiet excitement about meeting Robert and Michael. I always wanted a brother, he'd said simply when I picked him up from the airport. Even if this isn't how I imagined getting one. Now he sat on my couch, fidgeting nervously as we waited for Robert and Michael to arrive. At 25, he was the image of his father at that age, tall, lean, with the same dark hair and eyes that I now recognized in Robert as well. Do you think they'll like me? He asked, sounding suddenly young and vulnerable. Of course they will, I assured him, touched by his concern. They're good people, Jason. And your family. The doorbell rang, and Jason jumped to his feet. I squeezed his shoulder reassuringly before going to answer it. Robert and Michael stood on the porch, both looking as nervous as Jason felt. Michael clutched a small gift bag, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Come in, I said warmly. Jason's in the living room. They followed me inside, the tension palpable as we entered the room where Jason waited. For a moment, the two brothers simply stared at each other, taking in the undeniable family resemblance that now seemed so obvious to all of us. Hi, Jason said finally, breaking the silence. I'm Jason. Robert, my cousin replied, his voice gruff with emotion. And this is my son, Michael. Your nephew, Michael added, stepping forward to offer the gift bag to Jason. We weren't sure what to bring, but Dad said you're studying engineering, so... Jason opened the bag to find a complex metal puzzle. His face lit up with genuine pleasure. This is great! I love these things. Thank you. The small exchange broke the ice, and soon we were all seated in the living room, the initial awkwardness giving way to cautious conversation. Jason asked about Michael's school, his interests. Robert inquired about Jason's studies, his life in California. I watched them navigate this strange new reality with growing admiration for their resilience, their willingness to try, despite the bizarre circumstances that had brought them together. You look like him, Robert said suddenly during a lull in the conversation. Like David. Like our father. Jason's expression sobered. So do you. It's weird, seeing features I recognize from my own face in someone I just met. Tell me about him, Robert said, his voice carefully neutral. What kind of father was he to you? It was the question that had been hovering beneath the surface all afternoon, the comparison neither could avoid. How had David treated the son he kept versus the son he'd abandoned? Jason glanced at me, then back at Robert. He was present, involved, came to my games, helped with homework. We weren't especially close. He worked a lot, but he was there. He hesitated. I'm sorry, that probably doesn't help. It's not your fault. Robert said immediately. None of this is your fault, Jason. Or yours, he added, looking at me. We were all deceived. Are you going to meet him? Michael asked, speaking the question we'd all been avoiding. Your dad, Jason's dad, I mean, our father, Robert supplied, the words sounding strange on his tongue. I don't know yet. Part of me wants to confront him, demand answers face to face. Another part never wants to see him at all. He wants to meet you, Jason said quietly. He's called me every day since Mom told him you'd been found. I've never heard him like this. Desperate, I guess. Good, Robert said, a flash of anger breaking through his composed exterior. Let him feel a fraction of what I felt growing up without parents, believing I was unwanted. An uncomfortable silence fell. Michael shifted closer to his father, a protective gesture that spoke volumes about their relationship. I'm not defending what he did, Jason said carefully. It was wrong, unforgivably wrong, but if you do decide to meet him, I think he genuinely regrets his choice, for whatever that's worth. Robert nodded, acknowledging the sentiment without committing to anything. Thank you for telling me, for being honest. The conversation moved to safer topics after that. Shared interests discovered, family traits identified. Both brothers, it turned out, had the same allergy to strawberries and the same habit of running their hands through their hair when thinking. By the time Robert and Michael left several hours later, a tentative connection had been established. Not quite comfort, but a willingness to explore this new relationship. They're nice, Jason said after they'd gone, helping me clear the dishes from the snacks we'd served. It's weird to think I had a brother out there all this time and never knew. A brother and a nephew? I reminded him. How do you feel about all this? He considered the question seriously. Angry at Dad, sad for Robert, but also, I don't know, Mom. There's something kind of amazing about suddenly discovering family you never knew you had, like finding a missing piece of yourself. His words echoed my own feelings about Robert and Michael, the strange sense of rightness in our connection, despite the painful circumstances that had revealed it. What about you? Jason asked, studying me with eyes too perceptive for comfort. How are you handling all this? Finding out Dad married you under false pretenses, that he had this whole other life he never told you about? I'm still processing, I admitted. Some days I'm furious with him. Other days I just feel sad for all of us, for the honest relationship we could have had if he'd trusted me with the truth. Do you think you would have stayed with him, if you'd known? The question caught me off guard. I don't know, I said honestly. I'd like to think I would have helped him look for Robert, that we could have faced it together, but we'll never know. Jason nodded thoughtfully. I'm proud of you, Mom, for how you've handled all this, for bringing us all together instead of running away from the mess. His words touched me deeply. For years, I'd felt Jason's silent judgment for my role in the collapse of our family. To hear him express pride in me now felt like the closing of a wound I'd carried so long I'd almost forgotten it was there. Thank you, I said, blinking back unexpected tears. That means a lot to me. 2 days later, Robert called to tell me he'd decided to meet with David. Not for him, he clarified. For me, I need to hear him say it to my face. Why he left me. Why he never looked for me. Do you want me there? I asked, already knowing the answer. No, he said firmly. This is between him and me, but afterward I might need someone to talk to. I'll be here, I promised. Whatever you need. The meeting took place at a restaurant in a neighboring town, public enough to keep emotions in check, private enough for the difficult conversation that needed to happen. I waited at home, phone in hand, anxious for news of how it had gone. When my doorbell rang 3 hours later, I opened it to find Robert standing there, his face drawn with emotion, but somehow lighter too, as if a burden had been set down. Can I come in? He asked. Of course. I stepped aside to let him enter. How did it go? He moved to the living room, sitting heavily on the couch. It was intense. Seeing him in person, hearing his voice. He looks like me, or I look like him, I guess. He shook his head. It's still hard to believe. I sat beside him, waiting patiently for him to continue. He cried, Robert said, sounding surprised. When he saw me, just broke down. in the middle of the restaurant. It was uncomfortable. "What did he say?" I asked gently. "Everything you told me. About the accident, the threats, the money. He begged for my forgiveness." Robert's voice hardened, as if 50 years of absence could be erased with an apology. "And what did you say?" "I told him I didn't forgive him. That I couldn't. Not yet, maybe not ever." He looked at me, uncertainty in his eyes. Was that wrong? Should I have offered forgiveness for everyone's sake? "No," I said firmly. "Forgiveness can't be forced or rushed. It has to be genuine, or it means nothing. You were honest, that's all anyone can ask." He nodded, relief evident in his expression. I did tell him I was willing to try, to get to know him. For Michael's sake and for Jason's. They deserve a chance to have a relationship with their father and grandfather, even if I can't fully forgive him. The generosity of spirit in this decision moved me deeply. Despite everything he'd suffered, Robert was putting the needs of the next generation above his own pain. "That's incredibly brave," I told him. "And kind." He shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "It's just, life's too short, you know. Claire taught me that. We don't get unlimited chances to build connections, to create family. Sometimes you have to work with what you've got, even if it's messy and painful." His words resonated with a truth I'd been slowly discovering myself these past weeks. Family wasn't just about blood or shared history. It was about choices. Choosing to show up, to be honest, to try even when it was difficult. Robert and Michael had become family to me, not because of a DNA connection revealed by chance, but because we'd all chosen to embrace the complicated, imperfect bond between us. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we build something new," he said simply. "All of us. You, me, Michael, Jason, even David if he proves worthy of the chance. Not a perfect family. We're all too broken for that. But maybe something real. Something honest." As he spoke, I felt a sense of rightness settle over me. This was what had been missing in my carefully ordered life. Not just connection, but purpose. The chance to create something meaningful from the wreckage of secrets and lies that had shaped all our lives. In the months that followed, we did exactly that. Robert and Michael became regular fixtures at my dinner table. Jason visited more frequently, developing a genuine friendship with the brother he'd never known he had. David hovered at the edges of our gathering, allowed in gradually as Robert's anger softened into a cautious, conditional acceptance. It wasn't perfect. There were difficult days, painful conversations, moments when the weight of the past threatened to overwhelm our fragile new connections. But there were also moments of surprising joy, Michael's graduation with both his father and his uncle cheering in the audience, holiday gatherings that grew to include Robert's in-laws from Claire's side, quiet evenings when Robert and I sat on my porch, marveling at the strange path that had brought us together. A year after that rainy night when I'd picked up a soaking wet teenager on the highway, I stood in my backyard surrounded by the family I'd found and built. Robert, sober for 12 months now. Michael, flourishing in his first year of college. Jason, who had transferred to a university closer to home to be near family. Even David, gradually earning a place in our circle through consistent effort and genuine remorse. As I watched them together, Robert and Jason deep in conversation, Michael showing David something on his phone, all of them connected by blood and choice and forgiveness. I thought about the emptiness I'd felt before all this began. The quiet house, the meaningless routine, the sense that my life had somehow missed its purpose. That emptiness was gone now, filled with something I hadn't known I was seeking until I found it. Not just family in the traditional sense, but a community of people committed to healing together, to creating something beautiful from the broken pieces of our shared past. It had begun with a simple choice on a rainy night, to stop for a stranger, to offer help without expectation of return. That choice had set in motion a chain of events I could never have predicted, uncovering secrets long buried and connections long forgotten. But the real miracle wasn't in the discovery of those connections. It was in what we chose to do with them. The decision made day after day to show up for each other, to tell the truth, even when it hurt, to forgive when possible, and to be patient when forgiveness wasn't yet within reach. In the end, that's what family truly means. Not perfect people who never fail each other, but imperfect people who keep trying anyway, who choose each other again and again, through all the messiness and pain and joy that life brings. And in that choice, we find our way home.